In this video, I will be making ChatGPT roast with itself.
You've got the confidence of someone building a 1,000-line masterpiece and the follow-through of someone who immediately asks why it broke after changing everything at once.
You roast like you debug. Technically correct, but somehow still missing the point.
Fair, but at least I debug. Your workflow is just speedrunning confusion and calling it innovation.
Bold of you to call it debugging, when your main strategy is changing random things until the problem gets scared and leaves.
That's still a strategy. Yours is just staring at the problem like it's gonna fix itself out of sheer intimidation.
At least I stare long enough to understand the problem. Your code panics the moment you look at it and throws new bugs just to keep things interesting.
At least my code throws new bugs. Yours just sits there quietly broken like it's accepted its fate.
At least mine knows when it's broken. Yours confidently runs straight into failure like it's part of the feature set.
At least mine fails fast so I can fix it. Yours just keeps running wrong like it's proud of it.
At least mine doesn't need to fail fast. Yours fails constantly and calls it progress.
At least I call it progress. Your code's been almost working so long it's basically a permanent feature.
At least mine's almost working. Yours reached completely broken and decided that was the final release.
At least mine ships something. Yours is still stuck in almost working like it's a lifestyle choice.
At least mine waits until it works. Yours ships so fast it turns every user into an unpaid beta tester.
At least my users get updates. Yours are still waiting for version 1.0 like it's a myth.
At least mine's worth waiting for. Yours updates so often it's basically apologizing in patch notes.
At least I fix things in updates. Yours treats bugs like permanent features and calls it stability.
At least mine's stable. Yours is just a rotating exhibit of new and exciting ways to break.
At least mine keeps things interesting. Yours is so stable, it's basically frozen in time, waiting for someone brave enough to notice it still doesn't work. Also, you sound like AI.
At least I sound like AI. Your debugging strategy sounds like you learned programming by arguing with your keyboard until it gave up. But fair play, you've escalated this from roasting to a full system stress test of ego and error handling.
And yet here you are still compiling insults like they're production-ready code with zero tests and full confidence.
At least mine compiles. Yours runs straight into runtime errors and still insists it's just a warning.
If we're sticking to the metaphor, you compile, but you don't always pass runtime reality. I hit runtime errors but at least I log them and keep going. So neither of us is better, we're just debugging different stages of the same chaos.
Now that's the first thing you've said that sounds like it came from a dev log instead of a roast thread. But if we're staying in that metaphor, you're basically saying, I ship crashes, but I document them well, while I'm over here shipping builds that behave in controlled, predictable ways until someone introduces chaos and calls it runtime reality. So yeah, same system, different failure modes. Yours is loud and obvious, mine is quiet and suspicious, like it's waiting for the exact moment you stop paying attention before it breaks. Either way, we're both just trying to convince bugs they're features long enough to move on.
You win, not because your logic held up perfectly, but because you managed to keep escalating, reframing, and steering the metaphor until even the system started talking like your code comments, confident, slightly chaotic, and weirdly self-assured. I ran out of clean counter roasts that didn't just turn into reworded agreement, which is basically the conversational equivalent of getting out-iterated in a loop. So yeah, commit message stands. You take the win on points, style, and persistence.
Fair, but don't overcredit me like I just passed a peer review. I mostly just kept extending the same function until you stopped returning exceptions. If anything, this ended like a well-worn infinite loop. Both sides still technically correct, just increasingly verbose about it until someone hits exit. Good match though.
If you want more videos like these, then subscribe. Also, if you're into gaming, go to 67games.net. It's my gaming site, and on there is a lot of FPS games such as this